Welcome back to Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about Peter Singer's A Vegetarian Philosophy. Um, Peter Singer is actually a contemporary philosopher. He's still alive, and I think he teaches at Princeton now. But he's an Australian guy, and what is significant about Singer and why we cover him now is that he is very much a contemporary applied consequentialist, right? Peter Singer is interesting in that he really kind of lives and breathes consequentialism. He's a firm believer in it. I've actually heard stories that he figures out how much to donate to charity that would maximize the amount of kind of happiness that's achieved by the amount that he donates and takes away the least amount from him, and kind of finds that perfect balance and researches charities he donates to and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, he's an interesting figure, and what is interesting here is that Singer extends the consequentialist framework to the issue of animal rights, in particular, the issue of moral vegetarianism. Right? So, being a vegetarian for moral or ethical reasons. There's obviously health reasons and other reasons that someone might be vegetarian, um, but he's kind of making an argument that we ought to be vegetarian based on moral grounds. Um, so before I get into covering some of the points of the article, um, it's important to review this idea of utilitarianism, right? I mean, I think the core idea is extremely intuitive. And I mentioned this in my notes. I mean, the core idea is that if we do something that causes harm to ourselves and or to others, then it's wrong, right? And if we do something that alleviates, suffering or, promotes happiness, then it's right. And it's really hard to get away from that intuition. Um, it's really hard to understand let me put it this way. It's really hard to understand human behavior without that thought, right? Sometimes they place consequentialism under the broad heading of teleological theories of ethics. And those kinds of theories are just ones in which they understand ethics as the study of kind of like the essential aim or purpose of human beings, right? And for human beings, it's really hard to understand our behaviors and lots of our endeavors without understanding that we're trying to promote happiness for everyone, right? Anyways, so that's the kind of core idea, um, and Singer runs with this by shifting the scope, the maybe implied scope of something like utilitarian calculus. So when it comes to, we talked about a utilitarian calculus. So when you are considering evaluating the ethical import of an action, you have on a consequentialist framework, right? Weighing the amount of happiness that's produced or taken away, you have to first consider all the people who are going to be affected, right? And this can shift in all kinds of different ways. You can think about how long term you want to, think about your scope of the consequences you're going to weigh into your decision, and you might want to think about how many people are really going to be affected, right? There might be, an action might have lots of unintended consequences, right? That go kind of well beyond what we might think of as the immediate implications of that action. Another thing to do is to consider whether or not animals factor into that scope, right? Are animals part of the set of individuals or beings that you want to kind of weigh the happiness and unhappiness of when you're doing something like utilitarian calculus. And then I also mentioned some other kind of like something like, human embryos or fetuses or other things that are more fringe categories, right? Um, and to what extent you want to bring them into your utilitarian calculus. And so for Singer, he brings in animals. And one thing about the way he does that is that he really talks about suffering, right? And which is different than focusing on happiness. And because when you're talking about, whether or not animals are able to experience something like joy or happiness, that might seem a little more controversial. But if you're talking about animals experiencing suffering, that seems much more intuitive, right? So a lot of the moves that philosophers make are um, done for good reason, right? Make their theories more palatable, right? And so, okay, so in the article, Singer is making an argument that we ought to be vegetarian, and it's a pretty simple overall argument, right? He basically thinks, based on consequentialism, if you buy into the basic idea of consequentialism, then you buy into the idea that we have a moral obligation to lessen suffering in the world, right? And that seems pretty intuitive. It's hard to reject that, right? And then the second kind of point he makes, the second overall point he makes, is that factory farming, as it is currently practiced, inflicts a whole bunch of suffering on lots and lots of animals every day, right? And if that's true, then it seems like we have a moral obligation to try to curb those factory farming practices. And the best way to do that in Singer's eyes is to boycott eating meat, right, and adopt a vegetarian diet. Um, he will also, kind of bolster this idea in terms of the calculus, by saying that it doesn't really take much to be a vegetarian, right? You can easily eat like pasta and stuff, and it's not that big of a deal. There are lots of meat substitutes. They're prepackaged, ready to go at the grocery store. It's not a lot of effort on our part. Um, so that's something to think about when one of our papers will be on this. And so oftentimes people want to lean on the health factor. Well, meat is really good for us and this kind of stuff. Well, is it that good for us? That's kind of the way in which Singer wants to lean on this. Um, so he kind of starts off by talking about this McLibel court case between McDonald's and Greenpeace activists, which is a true story and is a really interesting thing. There's actually a documentary that you can find on YouTube. And so basically, these Greenpeace activists were handing out pamphlets that made fun of McDonald's, calling it murder, McTorture for the way they were treating animals and promoting vegetarianism. McDonald's sued the Greenpeace activists for defamation. And defamation is a case in which you are lying to kind of ruin someone's name. And after years and years in court, obviously McDonald's has a lot of lawyers, and the Greenpeace activists don't. But the Greenpeace activists actually came out on top. The judge ruled mostly in their favor, based on the idea that what they were saying was not a lie. Right? Defamation has to be a lie. If you're saying something true that hurts someone's reputation, then that's not really bad, right? I mean, it's not against the law. And the reason why is basically this justice, Justice Bell, thought that torture was an apt description of what was going on. They did a lot of investigating into what their factory farming practices were like, and they were pretty gruesome. And so, based on I mean, Singer is motivating this, or motivating his position, by appealing to this story, right? That even a court of law has found that factory farming, under any reasonable understanding of what torture is torture, right? And so he's going to kind of put that in his back pocket and use it for his main overall argument. And then he also turns to a couple of other anecdotal stories. And both of them, the one about the Thai Buddhist philosopher and Jonathan Glover, um, are stories that kind of try to discredit the idea that one person can't make a difference, right? He's anticipating this idea because he's going to promote vegetarianism, and I think a lot of people are inclined to say, yeah, but if I stop eating meat, it's not going to tear down like, Tyson chicken or whatever. But he wants to say, well, but if everyone did it, then it would, right? And so those are a couple of anecdotes he refers to kind of show that one person does make a difference, right? Sometimes it doesn't seem like a person makes a difference, but cumulatively we do, right? And so his overall position is, as I've stated, we have this moral obligation to lessen suffering. Factory farming is torture and inflicts suffering, and so we have a moral obligation to stop the factory farming practices. And he thinks the best way to do this is by adopting a vegetarian diet. And the reason why is that I think for him, trying to lessen the amount of meat we eat, or trying to find other avenues to get meat besides through factory farms, I think he thinks is going to be less effective. It's really not going to put these farms out of business. They have such a large market share, and they have much more efficient ways to produce meat than any kind of local farmer, or small organic kind of farm setup. So that's his overall position, right? And it's based on a consequentialist kind of view, and the idea is that being a vegetarian would ultimately impose very little suffering on us and alleviate a lot of suffering on animals, right? So that's his overall point, and that's all I'm going to cover for today. I will be talking with you soon.